Native American land acknowledgments are something that are read. Many universities do this. We read these before certain events, like my college meeting. And so my college has 3 schools, so all of us are there together. And then you read a statement about how ASU is built on indigenous lands that were taken due to colonization, and that we support Native American students. And that's 2 statements, and they put them together on purpose, because then if you object, like, well, so you don't want to help Native American students? Say, of course we want to support all Native American students. The first part of it, though, was about a theory of land ownership, which I don't agree with. But then what they started doing this semester is they said this, it's just beginning. I've been on Zoom for these. You can be on Zoom or in person. I'm on Zoom watching, and they say, all right, everyone, we're going to read the Native American land acknowledgement. I want you to bow your head and close your eyes. I was like, why? I mean, why are we bowing? That's a prayer stance, right? No one doubts that. If you see someone going like this in any religion, you say, oh, that person's praying.
Yeah.
This is a secular school. Why on earth are we praying? And who are we praying to?
Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Anthony Costello, and this is the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. I am joined today by Dr. Jacob Daniel and by Dr. Owen Anderson. And let me remind you that the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics is where we seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations for a moral and just society. And we are going to be looking at the foundations of a moral and just society today. And more concretely, we're going to look at some of the things that our guest, Dr. Anderson, has been observing at his university, which is Arizona State University is it in Tempe, Arizona,
Yeah.
Dr. Anderson? Right, Tempe. So Dr. Anderson, or Owen, welcome to the
Thanks for having me.
podcast for the Kirkwood Center. And perhaps just to start us off, you've been at ASU like your whole for a very long time. This
Very
is
long time. Yep.
maybe
Yeah,
give
it
us a little
wasn't.
background of just your story and
Yeah,
what you're doing today.
yeah, it wasn't necessarily the plan, but it's how it worked out. So I'm currently a professor of philosophy and religious studies at ASU. I'm at the Glendale campus. We have 4 campuses. So one you mentioned is in Tempe, and then there's 3 others. I'm at the Glendale campus, and I was told, because of some of what I've been talking about, that whenever I go on the media, I need to say the views I'm about to express are my own views and not ASU's views. I think you would have known that already,
Right.
but they told me specifically, since you're talking about this stuff, you need to say that. But I started out as an undergraduate in philosophy. I got introduced to Christian philosophy in high school, and I said, I didn't know that was a job. I want to be a philosopher. And so obviously it was secular, but I purposely wanted to go into secular school in order to do 2 things. That's where I wanted to work in order to defend the Christian faith, but I
Mhm.
also wanted to get the best exposure I could to alternative arguments.
Mhm.
I'd applied to religious schools like um, Seattle Pacific, Westmont, Wheaton. I got accepted, and I couldn't afford them.
Mhm.
So that is interesting. That directed me then to secular school, where I've been ever since. And I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I did another one in history, and then I got a fellowship to do a philosophy MA. I did that, and then I got grant money to do, or a TA position to do religious studies MA. And about that time, I started teaching for ASU also, and being a faculty associate. And then I got a PhD offer in philosophy and a lecturing job, which meant it was heavy teaching load, not research load. And so I started as a faculty associate, then a lecturer. And then when I finished my PhD, it happened that a department was looking for a tenure track person. You know, those don't come along. You don't say, well, no, I've been at ASU a while. I don't want to do that. So I applied. I had to go through the whole process, interviewing and everything. And they ended up hiring me. So I moved from PhD into assistant professor, and then got promoted to associate professor. And then 2018, I think, got promoted to full professor. So in that time, I've been the lead of my department. I've been faculty senate president. You know, been on all kinds of committees. So I've really seen how ASU works. I mean, I think if there's anybody who's seen it across a couple generations, it'd
It's
be
been
me. And
20 plus years then, at
oh
least.
yeah, I started undergraduate in the
Yeah.
'90s, so
Right. Okay.
97.
So from academic conception to maybe middle age, academic middle age,
Yeah, yep.
your whole career has been right there at
And then
ASU.
now obviously I've been a Madison fellow at Princeton for a year.
Okay.
I've given conferences elsewhere. I've taught. I've been to summer research in University of Hawaii on the East West
Mhm.
Center. I've taught at Biola, so I've done lots of other things.
Right.
And ASU's been great. I mean, I couldn't. Our president is full fledged for academic freedom.
Mhm.
So I've published on Benjamin Warfield and old school Princeton,
Oh, yeah.
from that all the way to postmodernism and critical theory stuff. So I've had a great amount of freedom to publish on things that interest me. And I've never been, critiqued or challenged. I've been promoted the whole time.
Right, right. Excellent. Wow.
So
Okay.
as a Christian, how has it been your experience over these years?
Well, like I said, professionally, I've never been critiqued.
Mhm.
The critique is always professional, meaning, I've had different levels of presses. I've had 3 books with Cambridge University Press,
Mhm.
but I didn't start there. I started at lower level presses. So I'd be encouraged, hey, they never said don't publish on old school Princeton. They just said, you got to aim higher for higher presses. So eventually I got up to Cambridge, and that's where you want to be. Um, but it's never been personal at that level. But at the social level, it's always been felt. I mean, I'm not in the group in the in group, so to
Okay.
speak, right? So the last number of years have especially been an in group in my school that focuses on decolonizing and anti-racism. And
Now,
so I'm
which
just not
school
included in that.
is which school is that again? Because
I'm in
it
the School of Humanities, Arts, and
oh, yeah.
Cultural Studies.
Okay. So it's not the philosophy program per se where you're
No,
at. It's a different
no.
okay.
We have
Uh,
our own
yeah.
philosophy minor, and then we have our own degree about philosophy and society, where we're doing a degree that's applying philosophy to social issues.
Hmm.
Now that tends, in my case, that means all of them.
Right.
In other cases, it might mean advocacy for critical race theory or something.
Well, it sounds right. Well, it sounds like I mean philosophy applied. I mean that was basically the Marxist maxim, right? In a
Mhm.
sense. Philosophers have always only thought about the world,
Yep.
but the goal is to change the world.
Yeah.
Um, but that's good though. And it sounds like an interesting program. It's sure to be
Oh
a
yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I
yeah.
mean, I was interdisciplinary doing philosophy, history, and religious studies before the universities had interdisciplinary. And so I always thought to myself, I remember having a history professor tell me, why are you studying religious studies and philosophy? Just do history.
Mhm.
And the other two would say the same thing. And I was always thinking to myself, no, I want to know world history. I want to know what happened in the
Right.
world. And then I
Right.
want to know all the religious systems I can, as well as philosophy. ASU, not as much now, but back then was really good in analytic philosophy. It'd be one of the top ranked schools for analytic philosophy back
Mhm.
then. We had a couple of professors that have left since then. But so I was getting so if you know that, that's like Frege
Well,
and Russell down to the
that's
president.
the I mean, over at here at Talbot is really an analytic philosophy program.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we
But
all had J.P. Moreland and
yeah.
William Lane Craig and Tim Picker-Vance in class,
Yeah.
and
Yes, you're
then
not going to get a lot of,
Continental.
philosophy begins with
Right.
Frege or Russell and
Right.
Whitehead, and it comes down to the present. So I want to know. I thought, that's interesting. It's good for logic, but I want to
Right.
know what's been going on since then.
Well, and it's not, and this is a point that Jacob and I and others in our, make a lot. Actually makes the larger social impact,
Mhm.
and I'd have to look back and say it. Where obviously analytic philosophy and analytic philosophy of religion are important. I would never want to throw away any tool in our toolkit.
Yeah.
What tends to seep, what I think clearly seeps into the culture and works its way through the culture and the church is much more from the continental.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, those problems of meaning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Existentialism.
Right. So, I mean, the more mathematical you get in your philosophizing, the
Mhm.
smaller an audience you're
Yep.
generally going to be able to address, I think.
I would
Uh,
love for you to address more something that you mentioned, the pure distinction between these disciplines and
Yeah.
not allowing them to come together as you're experiencing it. I mean, would you say much of the challenges that you're seeing socially or even on campus is kind of like a byproduct of that pure dissection of these disciplines?
Well, I think I've kind of spanned 2 generations. So that the generation I came in on was still disciplinary instead of interdisciplinary, and it was multicultural, which it didn't make any evaluations about cultures, but it did say None's better than any other one, and you should know about all of them.
Hmm.
Now the generation that's currently in charge is interdisciplinary, or even they call it transdisciplinary, where there aren't even, disciplines themselves are just artificial inventions.
Mhm.
And they're no longer holding to multiculturalism. They're willing to say, no, there are bad cultures.
Mm.
Western civilization is one of them,
Mm.
and other cultures should be elevated at the expense of Western culture.
Hmm.
So that's a
Well,
big shift.
yeah,
Some people could say, I saw that coming a mile away with multiculturalism.
Yeah.
But you don't have to go there. Multiculturalism, it is true. Like I said, in my case, I just wanted to know what all different cultures teach.
Hmm.
I'm genuinely interested in those human differences. So you don't have to go from that to saying Western culture is the bane of human existence.
well, I'm gonna segue from there because now that we brought that up, and then, we'll get to some of these other questions about I wanna ask more specifically, about what you're seeing on campus and classrooms and so on and so forth, but on that vein of making moral adjudications about or normative adjudications about entire cultures,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is something that, as I was reading some critical legal studies material a few years ago, specifically an author by the name of Kenneth B. Nunn, and this was a article that was written in 1997, so it's long coming, where this particular author, and I think it could be found in other critical legal studies, writings, is doing exactly that. It's saying that there's something like there's a
Mhm.
Eurocentric culture that has been dominant. In one sense, that we could say, yeah, that's probably true. But then it goes further than that to sort of outline these what are called like cognitive faculties or features that are sort of particular
Mhm.
only to
Yeah.
European peoples.
Yeah.
And they're innate, like we were born into them.
Mhm.
Right, and now it's this is, you go a lot of and you could say and these, like, ingrained cognitive features of Europeans, they form this sort of matrix that is deeply immoral,
Mhm.
right, and problematic,
Yeah.
and this is what we have to sort of awake out of,
Right.
right?
And think about what we just said. If that was said about any other culture, you'd say, well, that's the definition of racism.
That's
That
yeah,
they're
yeah,
you could say about them that they've gotten some bad habits, but they're not saying that. They're saying it's innate. These are just wicked
innate,
people with these innate problems.
he says
And
it's
what you
European nature in the
Yeah.
article. He calls
Well,
it
that's not unique to him.
nature.
I've done research and written an article on Anibal Quijano, who was a
Okay.
South American
Mhm.
sociologist who wrote the same kind of thing in his decolonizing work. He kind of started the idea of decolonizing philosophy. And yeah, he would say he gets I liked him just because he gets closest to showing what the two sides are. And
Yeah.
he like Derrida, identified the logos as the problem. So
Right,
Derrida says the same thing.
exactly,
It's the
yeah,
logos centric, and he
logo.
gets the same thing. We're the whole world besides the Europeans are holistic, and we aren't. The whole world besides the Europeans is holistic, and the Europeans are focused on the logos. And I was thinking to myself, well, I think the pagan Europeans also held a similar view. I think what you're zeroing in on is Christianity.
Yeah, that's
And
what
insofar as some Europeans became Christians, and yeah, they focused on the logos. But before the Christians showed up, you couldn't say they're logocentric in England or Scandinavia.
yeah. Well, right, and of course you have to eliminate, also the Greeks as well. The Stoics
Mhm.
had a logos doctrine, obviously.
Yep.
You'd have to get rid of I mean, and of course, I think most people have discerned is the attack is it's a two-pronged attack. One is, certainly on the Judeo-Christian heritage, but the other's on the classical canon,
Yeah.
right,
Well, I
of
think so, but
Greek
the only difference
philosophy.
there is I think when you do look into the Greeks, you'll still find that the logos tends to be something like this, the basis of all being, in
Yeah.
which we all participate also.
Right.
Whereas the Christians following Judaism are making a clean distinction. God
Right.
is God and you're not God.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, and that was something that I also noticed in that article, and we'll link to that, and we're gonna link to, a lot of your stuff on the Substack where you're posting a lot
Oh,
of
thank you. Yeah.
things on this, and,
I'll
the,
tell the story about that too in a minute.
yeah, because one of the 7 features that, None, and probably others list is called, that he the charge is against, again, Eurocentric thinking.
Mhm.
Is that Eurocentric thinking, which again is innate to all Europeans,
Mhm.
desacralizes nature. that
Yeah,
term desacralization, which I think then this will be a good segue into maybe some of the things you've been seeing on campus. And that idea is that, Europeans just see nature as sort of this dead material.
exactly. Yeah,
And
this is a
because it's dead
Marxist.
material, right, it can be manipulated
Yeah,
and dominated over however
yeah,
which way one chooses. And what needs to sort of happen is a re-sacralization of nature. But
yeah.
this is not like a Catholic sense of seeing
No,
nature as sacramental.
as not a revelation. Like, it's important because it's a revelation of God. It
Right.
is the deity, and that the other scholar I mentioned, Anibal Quijano, says the same thing.
Yeah.
The problem is the Europeans view this, and poor Descartes gets blamed. I mean,
For everything.
if anyone
Yeah.
says if anyone
Yeah.
says there's a problem with modernity, and you say, "Oh, who
Yeah.
started the problem?"
Yeah.
Descartes,
Right.
poor guy, because most of the things they say he didn't actually say, or when they do say something, other people said it before him.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I think you
but
pointed
yeah,
out that in the other in your interview with Dr. Zhang,
Mhm.
and that is so true. I mean, everybody says, "Well, Descartes, da
Yeah,
da
but so
da
he
da
gets
da." Yeah.
so Quijano pointed to him and said, "Yeah, he's the one who said there's two things, mind and matter is just this dead thing that you can do anything with." And so that's the problem of the Europeans. Now, I think that, like I said, the pagan Europeans believed creation was divine. So it's not Europe,
Yeah.
it's Christianity.
It's Judeo-Christianity, yeah, it's Judaism too.
Yep, yep.
The
Well, and technically Islam,
Yeah.
there's a there's a weird relationship they have with Islam. But yeah, I mean, of the three of them, Islam's been the strongest in saying no images, period. Right.
Right, right.
So yeah, the theistic religions are pretty clear on there's God and there's creation. They're not the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Well, let's move in then to this question of, is there or are we seeing a connection between critical theory and then actual, I don't know what we call the reemergence of pagan practice
Mhm.
at universities, right? In
Yeah.
in the education system. So I heard you on Dennis Prager's show
Yeah.
a couple weeks ago. I was just leaving Arizona. I just visited a friend who works at GCU.
Okay.
And as I was driving back on, I think that Monday, a couple weeks ago, I heard you on
Yeah, turn the radio on. There I am.
with Prager. Yeah, and so give us some sense of what's going on at ASU, and maybe also a little bit what happened with this Prager event. And,
Yeah, I'll start there because that's the story leading to my Substack.
okay, good.
Dennis Prager and Charlie Kirk were coming to campus,
Mhm.
and ASU has a number of colleges, right? One of them is the Honors College, and the great majority of their faculty wrote a letter to their dean saying that Charlie Kirk and Dennis Prager are white bigots or white nationalist bigots, and they shouldn't be given a lecture, podium to speak from at ASU. Now they weren't invited by the Honors College. These persons just thought we'll get involved in this. So myself and then two other colleagues, that's all we could get. Like, so ASU's got number of thousands of faculty. Only three of us said that violates academic freedom.
Mhm.
Um, First, the name calling, right? That they linked some proofs that they're bigots, and all the proof came from Media Matters, which is a far left wing
Right,
source. So it's like, yeah, you can't, it's like, sort if you're defending a conservative and you quote Breitbart, I mean, you got to give better. Don't you expect your students to give better evidence than that?
right.
So yeah, we objected. We wrote a letter. It got picked up in the Daily Wire, and then yeah, nothing happened. In fact, it probably made the event even bigger. Like we were in a 2,000 person auditorium. It was packed. And so the event went off fine. Nothing bad happened. The event was about how to be happy. And it wasn't about how to be happy if you're white or how to be happy if you're Jewish or Christian. It was
Mhm.
about how any human can be happy. So it was just a weird topic for them to zero in on and say, we object to this subject, right? It wasn't limited to conservatives being happy versus liberals.
Right.
So
Well, Prager has for decades done this happiness hour on his
yeah, that's
show,
all. Yeah, it was just like that.
right?
Yep.
Which is always a
It,
great
it had on Robert Kiyosaki also, who's the Rich Dad Poor Dad
yeah.
author.
Oh yeah, okay.
And then a really famous heart surgeon who practices locally, Dr. Patel, and
Mhm.
he I understand, I think he's Hindu. So we had, I think Robert Kiyosaki's secular, Dennis Prager is Jewish,
Right.
and then I think Charlie Kirk. It sounds like, did he convert to Judaism? He was
I thought he
talking
was
about
Catholic.
Dennis
I
Prager
don't know.
helping him with the Sabbath. So I don't know if he's practicing the
Okay.
Sabbath now or what. So anyway, it wasn't like a one view, one perspective only.
It
So
wasn't
then,
like all bearded Reformed pastors up there.
yeah, right, yeah, and
I'll just
nothing,
jump in. Yeah, I'll just jump in
yeah,
and ask.
do.
You mentioned that there were so many other faculty members, and many
Mhm.
of them, out of those, might be conservatives, not necessarily
Yeah.
Christians. What made three of you actually take this, stance and really confront this issue?
Yeah, well, it's interesting.
Yeah,
A couple of people we talked to said, "I agree with you, but I don't like to have confrontations."
yeah,
For me, I've seen one. I want to defend academic freedom, and that always means defend it for everybody, right? It's easy to defend it when it's for something you agree with. If you don't agree, then you'll say, "Yeah, I don't really care if it slips this time." So, of course, I am on the conservative and Christian side, so I do defend those views, but I recognize that means for everybody.
yeah,
So the other professors, I think, I don't think professors are confrontational people. They tend to attack from the sidelines. So they will attack, but it's usually from the sidelines or a letter written by everybody.
Right.
But to have to stand out, and Dennis Prager made this point, the outliers are the ones that make changes.
Mhm.
And they don't tend to like to be that way because you can then take hits.
yeah,
So I think it's something deeply ingrained in academics. So what made me want to do that is, again, I see the need for academic freedom, and then I've been here so long. It's 100 to 1 the number of radical left wing talks and the conservative talks. So the idea of them objecting to one conservative talk when I know they've got 100 on their side told me we'll never have a talk by a Christian again, right? Or a conservative again. So I have to say something now because it is going to come down to you can't say anything Christian on a campus or you'll get faculty writing a letter.
Yeah.
yeah.
I
And
mean,
again, this wasn't even a Christian event.
isn't
It's
that
just,
Mhm.
isn't that kind of the the Marxist idea, political sense, though, that you have to stamp out any dissenting voice. I mean, there can be no remnant of
well, you label them as the things you said.
antithesis
They're
out
not
there.
dissenters because
Yeah.
that means they're rational and they have an argument. And then what you do with that person is you get into the discussion and you show their arguments unsound. What you do is you dehumanize them. They're
Right.
bigots.
It's always a personal.
They're ingrained. This is a bad problem ingrained from their culture. They can't get rid of it. So you say something like that. The one I've been focusing on is phobic,
Yeah,
right?
the word.
They're
Yeah.
homophobic.
Term. Mhm.
That's from Freud. He
Yeah.
talks about phobias of those kinds of things. And again, it takes it out of a rational discussion.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of anything. I just think that it's immoral. It
Right.
takes it out of that conversation and makes it a psychological problem. You've got a neurosis, and it dates back to your own sexual upbringing, and
Right.
you've been suppressing things since then. And so it's a whole different discussion then, rather than a rational discussion. And
Yes.
again, they'll say, "Well, that's so European. This want a rational discussion."
Exactly.
I think that's insulting to the peoples of the world, right? You're telling me the other peoples of the world aren't rational? That's just wrong.
Well, I always felt too like this claim is so anthropologically demonstrably false, right? Because basically what you're claiming is that, um, and again, I'm going back to this article where he labels things like dichotomous thinking,
Mhm.
objectification, abstraction as European. I mean,
Yeah,
he'll qualify a little bit. He'll step back and he'll say, "Well, these might be displayed in some other cultures, like
yeah,
they're displayed in all cultures."
yeah.
Right? But yeah, but you shift to what I think is a purely political kind of engagement. It's a psychological and political engagement. It's this old Saul Alinsky tactics, right?
Mhm.
As well. And I mean, I remember in that book, why is I'm blanking on the name? The one that
Oh,
he
rules for radicals?
Rules for Radicals.
Yeah.
I think it's rule number 4, where he talks about how to use Christianity against Christians. Right? And this is one phenomenon I think
Yep.
we're seeing
Oh, yeah.
throughout the church,
It is for sure.
because you just hold Christians' feet to the fire on every moral standard that they
I thought you're
consider
supposed to be
to be
loving.
true. Right, exactly.
Why are you
And we
judging
all know
people?
that none of us are perfectly loving, so you just can constantly come back, "Well, that you're clearly not loving enough."
I
You
Mhm.
think
know?
from an anthropological standpoint, I mean, they end up actually in that kind of duality of pollution and purity, and that extends not just to the creation itself, but also individuals. And
Yeah.
that's where the whole idea of untouchables come in. It's not on the basis of ideas; it's on the basis of pure behavior or public
Mhm.
behavior that individuals actually exert.
Yep. Well, and so out of this, I created a Substack, Dr. Owen Anderson, just to keep track and say, look, I'm going to document all the radical leftist things we do on campus. So there's a list of them. So next time someone says, "Why are we having a conservative here?" Say, well, that's one in every 2 years compared to this list. And I mean, there's stuff up there. We've had people doing witchcraft. I mean, they're not teaching. I've been in religious studies. I teach religion in America, so we go over witchcraft, but
Mhm.
they're teaching how to do it to
Mm.
students.
Okay,
So that's maybe.
let's talk about this.
And the
So
sexuality stuff is
yeah,
just over the top. I mean,
because
it's
yeah, go ahead.
well, yeah. I mean, you guys can look there, but yeah, the sexuality they teach again, it's not about, but it's advocating in the sense of saying, now you should pick what you are. You've been raised with male and female, which we all know is wrong. Now we've gone through this. What are you? And so that's like a missionary class, and for this
Right.
viewpoint.
This is not a dispassionate analysis. This
Mhm.
is active endorsement.
Yep,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah.
so okay, and so these are the types of things that we're seeing at places like ASU. I know it's happening in other campuses as well. ASU is not unique in this. We hear stories from about the Ivy League schools and what goes on
Yep.
there, sex weeks or whatever it may be. But let's focus in then on, you mentioned the active endorsement of something like um, pagan
Mhm.
invocations to pre-Christian gods, and some of those connected to these what do you call these homages to sort of Native American land and so on and so on. So tell us a little bit about what you.
Yeah, so both I'll do both things. The Native American land acknowledgments are something that are read. Many universities do this. We read these before certain events, like my college meeting. And so my college has 3 schools, so all of us are there together, and then you read a statement about how ASU is built on indigenous lands that were taken due to colonization, and that we support Native American students. And that's 2 statements, and they put them together on purpose, because then if you object, like, well, so you don't want to help Native American students? Say, of course we want to support all Native American students. The first part of it, though, was about a theory of land ownership, which I don't agree with. But then what they started doing this semester is they said it's just beginning. I've been on Zoom for these. You can be on Zoom or in person. I'm on Zoom watching, and they say, "All right, everyone, we're going to read the Native American land acknowledgement. I want you to bow your head and close your eyes." I was like, "Why? I mean, why are we bowing? That's a prayer stance, right? No one doubts that. If you see someone going like this in any religion, you say, "Oh, that person's praying."
Yeah.
This is a secular school. Why on earth are we praying? And who are we praying to? Right? Exactly.
Right, right. So
And,
it's a
and
little
you know,
bit
this is not just happening in secular universities. I know of so-called Christian
Really?
universities acknowledging it. And one of the ways they're doing it is actually they may restrict their own faculty members and other staff to actually do it, but they are absolutely fine. If someone they invite from outside, they come and invoke that.
I gotcha.
So that's happening with the gender issues. That's happening with
Yeah.
all, yeah,
Well, yeah, and I contacted FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and they said they can read it. They can't require you to believe it
yeah.
or say it, but they can read it to you as an employer. They also got involved when Dennis Prager was here, because I was asked not to talk to the media without ASU's permission. And so then I contacted FIRE, and they said, no, he can talk to the media. And that's when they clarified, okay, just make sure you always say, these are my views. Now, my question is, does every single liberal professor get that same email, or just the one conservative guy talking up? And I
This
think,
reminds me, this reminds me of one of
that
my.
would be interesting to know. But I mean, I think the assumption is probably it's just you getting that email, right? And your 2 or 3 other colleagues
you know,
who are standing up. Um, what
did you have
so
a question too, Jacob?
yeah,
No, I was saying this reminds me of an experience I had in Oxford where even the churches were actually pushing this, that you can belong without believing.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So more of
that's,
a social
yeah,
center.
yeah, that becomes way too common. Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah. So that I think the second story about the increase of paganism, it's usually attached to something at first. So, for example, feminism, and that's a long history. My religion in America class, when we look at some female religious leaders in the 1900s, they were invoking feminism and paganism, or witchcraft, or spiritualism. So that argument might be that women are more in touch with the spiritual realm than men are. And
right.
that's why they're special. And that's why men try to stop them and keep them out of being priests or pastors. So that's not new. It's just that maybe people didn't know that was going on. When they praised certain feminists, they may not know they were deeply anti-Christian.
Yeah,
And
right.
so now, fast forward to where we're at today, it's usually comes in the university that way. So it'll be a topic like feminism and the occult. But then, since we know feminism is true, this is the argument. We know feminism is true, and we know it's connected to the occult. We therefore also know the occult is true. And so then it goes from about class, because I teach about these things, but it
Right.
goes from that to we know these things are true. And if you object, you're objecting to feminism. So you're telling me men and women aren't equal, they'll say. So no, I agree about that. So that's the strategy they use, right?
Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, this is something too that Rufo was pointing out. There was, as I mentioned earlier, that was going on in the LA County school districts at the grade school level,
Hmm.
where they were honoring the Mexican American children in the class, and then, but also invoking literally invoking the names of the Aztec gods,
Yeah,
right? And then even beyond that, doing a kind of chant
about
to
it, huh?
the Aztec gods. But what was incredibly, I don't say bizarre, was the chant to the Aztec gods was not to like give victory to the Aztec nations over over their enemies.
Yeah,
It was for social justice to occur.
yeah,
So it was this odd synthesis, maybe not so odd, given what again what's going on here, of pre-Christian pagan practice,
mhm. Well,
like
that
reference to the ancient gods
yep,
with sort of a social a Marxist social justice
yeah.
sort of
That's how they
content.
modernize it, because
Yeah,
you can't just come up and say, "Hey, I'm going to start teaching about Quetzalcoatl." Say, "Well, that's a long time ago." Yeah, say, "Well, I'm doing it because of Marx, social justice stuff." Okay, that's current. But I mean, there was 100 years ago, in 1926, there was an armed conflict in Mexico over this between the Catholic priests and then radicals who were Marxists, and they were using the Aztec gods, not that they believed in them, but as anti-Catholic and
right.
anti-European
Just as
symbols to
polemical
unify
symbol,
them. So
right.
again, this stuff's been going on for a while.
Okay,
People
good.
may not have
Good to
known
know.
about it, but now it's kind of coming to the forefront. But to do that to honor Hispanic students has got to be insulting to a majority of the Hispanic students who are Catholic
Or Catholic
or
or
evangelical,
evangelical in this
because
area.
they believe it, not
Yeah,
Yeah.
because someone in Europe told them to. And so
right.
it dehumanizes them and takes away their agency and says, well, you only believe it because some missionary 200 years ago told a relative of yours about it. And they say, no, I believe it because I think it's true. Christ has
True.
changed my
Yes.
life.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because there can't be claims that are believed because you think they're authentically true,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It's always,
I was
that's how Marx starts too. It's
right,
you begin with the assumption only matter exists.
right.
And so religion has to be explained as a sociological phenomenon. Begin with that assumption, you move forward. And that's what I'm noticing is not debatable. That's what I'm trying to bring out my Substack. What things will they refuse to debate me on? Because when this happened back in February, I also said, I'll publicly debate any one of these honors professors or all of them at once on this topic of academic freedom. And it was interesting to watch them because they kind of backpedaled and said, no, we weren't trying to cancel him, Charlie Kirk and Dennis Prager.
Mhm.
We were just letting our dean know we have a concern. Well, your letter didn't say that.
Yeah.
And if you have a concern, don't go to the event. You don't have to write a
That's it.
letter.
That is fascinating because, we see, read, and hear stories like all the time. Oh, well, we did this, but and somebody called it the Mote and Bailey fallacy.
Yeah, probably is.
If
Yep.
you heard that, where and
Yep.
where there you have the moat out front, and then but there's the Bailey, which is like the keep where you
Little
retreat
castle.
back
Yeah.
into, right? And you say like, so you say one thing like we did this. Oh, but it's like the
You're changing the.
69
I think it's the
19
same as
right,
like changing the goal lines too, right? Like
changing the goal lines.
I was aiming for this goal, then you get there and they say no, though that's not really what it
That's not
was.
really what we're doing. So when you get challenged, you retreat back into your Bailey,
Yep.
your keep, and say,
Yep.
"Oh, well, we only just want to teach history.
Yeah.
We're only trying to teach history. We weren't really trying to
Mhm.
change history or alter it. We just want to teach
Yeah.
the whole."
Or practice,
Yeah, well, we
paganism in the
all agree with
classroom.
that.
And
Uh,
this is, I think this is exactly why there has to be a resistance on our part. And what you're doing is so relevant. And I think professors in the academia will have to be intentionally involved, not just
Mhm.
working behind the scene, but actually in the forefront and making
Yeah.
all resistance possible.
Yeah, because there was something I took for granted, multiculturalism or institutional neutrality. Now I know that bothers some Christians. They'll say there's no neutrality, but I think in the sense I'm in there's institutional neutrality, meaning ASU doesn't say be a Christian, be a Hindu, be a Muslim, be a Marxist. It allows all those perspectives to be there and be debated. And that's the kind of culture we live in. We live in a pluralist culture. There's representatives from all those and more belief systems. And so we should know what they say and we should be able to interact with them. So I think that's right for a state school.
Yeah.
But it's shifted from that now
Mhm.
since I've been there to, and it was always a little bit, of course, on the atheist side, but there would still be respectfulness about religion. So it's shifted now to no, we know for sure this critical race stuff is true and feminism and the occult, and we know for sure uh, Christianity is not true, and it's been the curse of the modern world. So when you read into the things, these articles about decolonizing, you realize, oh, that's not just about local government. Because I'm a local government guy,
Yeah.
and I think we should have local government. If a government that was being ruled from some other centralized source wants to be local, who can I, as an American, how can I blame them? Right? That was what we were concerned about. But that's not what it is. It's about we've been controlled by these beliefs, and we want to go back to our pre 1500 belief systems.
Right, right. It's the removal of the uh, pre-political theological foundations,
Mhm.
Yeah.
right? That our system of law, jurisprudence, governance is based on.
Yeah. So when you were mentioning a legal scholar, so critical legal theory is
Yeah.
something I've studied also, and they use statistics a couple ways. Their statistics will either be one that's just irrelevant. It'll be like a poll of different racial groups and how they view each other.
Mhm.
And of course, that only tells us about what they think. It doesn't tell us about reality. But then the second kind that they heavily rely on are polls that show disproportionate realities between racial groups. So, for example, it'll show like whites have this much income,
Right.
Hispanics are a little less, blacks are a lot less, Asians are way above even the whites
Mhm.
and doing the best. And so they'll say the only way to explain that is institutional racism.
Racism, yes.
And so you can say, well, there's other reasons to explain that.
Yeah.
It's not just that it's systematic. If you have examples of discrimination, because of these kinds of discussions, we currently have federal and state laws for you to prosecute that, which is wonderful. Because there was a time where that wasn't very easy to
Yeah.
prosecute. But now, if you can show me, I mean, here's another one: men make more than women, and those statistics will be across all jobs and all ages. But it sounds like what that means is that at ASU, Professor Anderson makes more than female colleagues. And that's not what those show. That's illegal. And you can prosecute that.
Right.
In a job, doesn't matter if you're male or female, you'll make the same rate. I think Jordan Peterson's been best known for pointing out this is because of free will choices that men and women make about the kinds of jobs they want.
Right.
And so that's something that's never factored in. People have free will and they have
Which
different
also
cultural patterns.
presupposes something like a difference between men and women as well, and what they're
Well,
interested
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, he'll say, I mean, one of the things he points out is just that certain kinds of dangerous jobs tend to attract men and not women.
in. Right.
Now, you could try to fight that and get women pushed into them, but what I'm asking is, what about free will? What if they just don't want to do that? Why is
Exactly.
that wrong?
Right. Do
Or
the
why is that
quotas
something that can be corrected?
do
I don't know
quotas have
that's
to override people's free choices because we just
yeah.
have the utopian
But that's what's
vision in
scary is
mind, we have to plan it out that way.
these kinds of thinkers
Yeah.
in Marxism
Yeah.
think that way.
Yeah.
You don't want to
And
do it, but you're deluded and you should want to do it, and I'm going to make you do it.
well, this is what, and I'm reading like this massive seminal biography on the Frankfurt School
Mhm.
by Wiggershaus. Just a huge. It's translated from the German. I wouldn't want to
Wow.
read it in the German, but and this is the idea. It's in there. It's everything has to be planned out. Now, of course, the Frankfurt School is talking about a rational plan
Mhm.
of literally the planned society, right?
Yep.
Now their understanding of rationality is probably even different than where
It's
we're at
just
today.
practical rationality. Yeah.
Yeah,
Habermas is just rationality for him just means efficiency and practical outworkings of things. So
right.
I think I would critique his view and say that's not actually rational. It's your very limited view of what reason is.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's good. Well, I wanted to go somewhere else continue on this line, but to go a little bit different direction then. Of We talked about there's this and the attack is on the foundation. We talk about decolonization. This
Mhm.
is an attack on really the foundations, the pre-political, theological, biblical foundations for the institutions that the founding fathers built up. Um, and this is one thing that let me ask you this. and this is I was reading a small book by Alistair McIntyre, which I think is invaluable. It's called Marxism and Christianity,
Hmm.
where he points out this idea of Marx being, very clearly, many have pointed this out, but Marx being the replacement Christianity for the modern world,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yeah, I've
And
said I think he's the most successful cult leader.
yeah,
Right.
well, him or Muhammad, right? One of the two. I think actually Paul Kangor has a book out called Marx and the Devil or something like this.
Yeah, that's one about his interest in Satanism.
Yeah, which I haven't read that, so I don't want to say too much about it. But this idea of Marx being sort of an immanentized Christianity,
Yeah.
which also came up in your you guys talked about that
Yeah, we
a
did.
couple weeks ago as well. Um, and Jacob has made this point before. And I think this is true. There really is no, because one of the other figures that the critical legal theorists will go after is Rawls,
Mhm.
right? They don't, the veil of ignorance and this idea of having like a pre-political rationality of all rational
Yeah.
people can agree on. They reject, I think
It's
they
always embodied.
reject that, right? It's always embodied, it's always enculturated, it's always in society, it's always dynamic. So what I'm thinking, I mean, there really is not a non-theological basis
Yeah.
for jurisprudence or governance of a country.
I think that's right. In my book, The Declaration of Independence and God, I make the case that the Declaration of Independence is rooted in natural theology.
Right. Yes.
So it doesn't quote a Bible verse when it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're all created equal, which means there's a God that created us. Um, there's a rich history of natural theology. So the objection to Christianity, let's say that's level 2, but it's being done at level 2 because they're not paying enough attention to level 1, which is that there's a clear general revelation for everybody, which the
Right.
product of that's called natural theology. And that reveals God to us. And it's our sin against God that makes us need Christianity, the Bible,
Right.
and Christ. So they're objecting up there, but then what they put in the place of Christianity, some kind of paganism, it's not Christianity that objections to paganism. I mean, thinkers through the ages have pointed out how silly paganism is.
Yeah.
So they still have to deal with those objections, even
Like
apart from,
Socrates.
yeah, even apart from revealed religion.
Right. Yeah.
And
No,
the point that it directs to the God of the Bible is also because of the fact that it says we hold these truths to be self-evident that we all are created equal.
Yeah.
That aspect of equal would only lead you to a God of the Bible. I don't see, when I teach world religions, I don't see that happens in pantheistic worldview or even in
I think
Islam.
so. It's what Paul says this in Athens to the philosophers, and he's quoting Genesis 1 or thinking of Genesis 1 when he says, we all came from original parents. And because of that, we're all the same. And so, yeah, you'd have to have God making 2 original parents, and then everyone else after that's related.
well, and so on 2 theological points here. One, the question is, this is all grounded in the Imago Dei, right? That we have a metaphysical status in virtue of being made in the image and likeness of God that makes us
Yeah.
all equal.
Yeah.
How does that hold up if there's a reversion back to some kind of pre-Christian
What
folk
makes us
religion?
human? Well, I was
Right.
reading
What
the
makes us
City of
human?
God,
Yeah.
City of God the other day, and Augustine had this line that the further people get from God, the closer they get to being like an animal.
Mhm.
And he's talking here about, Rome before it falls.
Yes.
But in our culture, we have people advocating becoming like an animal, pretending like you're an animal, thinking you're an animal, or doing sex like you're an animal.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, there's something there when you forsake the image of God and our ability, really rooted in our ability to understand and know God, have that relationship with him. You put yourself back on the animal level. And the main critique of the Declaration, which says we're all equal, is evolution. In
Yes.
evolutions, we're not equal. In fact, it can't, if we're equal, it doesn't work. You have to be unequal and fighting with each other. And so that's true in Darwin and then also in Marx. Marx starts off the Communist Manifesto by saying all of history is just a class struggle, which is the economic version of Darwin's biological point.
Right.
So we're all just fighting each other, the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and we're not equal. And that's what's moving history. Whereas what you're pointing out is, no, we're all equal in this sense, that we're all made in the image of God. So we're all able to understand. We all can know God. We all have value. Whatever other talents we have value before God and before each other. We have to be respected because of that. And so a lot of that legal history is being overlooked. And instead, what they'll do is they'll point out something like slavery
Mhm.
and then civil rights problems after that. And they'll say that's the institutional racism.
Right.
And one of their favorites is housing problems in the 1930s, where loans weren't given to African Americans or only in certain areas of the city.
Right.
Now, that was done under FDR.
Right.
So I've said, maybe we should have reparations. Maybe the Democratic Party needs to pay reparations back to the people they harmed with those policies.
Right.
And that
Exactly.
includes, if we're going to go there, maybe the Democratic Party should pay reparations back to the Republicans because they killed hundreds of thousands of Republicans in the Civil War. So if we want to talk about reparations, it's going to probably be at the foot of the Democratic Party.
And the sword. And that was interesting because there was a discussion. There was a woman, I can't remember, I think it was a British woman who was being questioned about reparations for ancestors of former slaves. And she said, "Oh, I'm all for reparations, but let's push it all the way back to the people who are real. Let's push it back to the people in Africa who were enslaving, who were the source
Well,
of
that's
the
the truth is,
enslavement itself.
I
And
heard this quote the other
let's
day
get those
about a
African nations to fork up the
yeah,
reparations."
because that's where slavery came from, was Africans capturing Africans and then
Yeah,
selling them
or
mostly
Muslims from the
mostly
north.
to the Arab world.
Yeah, right.
And then the ones that went to America was mostly the Caribbean and Brazil.
Yeah.
And also, like if
Uh,
you see, like there were close to like 3,000 free slaves who owned 12,000
yeah,
other slaves, black
yeah,
slaves. So
yeah.
what about reparation from them as well?
And there was Native Americans who owned slaves in the South. So, well, I'm thinking about it this way. I heard this quote the other day. The things America has done outstanding things that make it unique, but its sins are universal. In other words, if you critique America in the 17 and 1800s for owning slaves, you're critiquing the whole world because they
The
all
whole
did.
right.
Everyone had that sin. But the things America did that are unique, and the English might say, wait a minute, we're a little ahead of them. We fought to stop slavery, right?
Mhm.
And we treated people as if they're equal. I was just reading an account of the Trail of Tears, which is when the Southern Cherokee tribes were all taken to Oklahoma, and I'm reading an account of all the missionary work to start schools in their areas and how that allowed them to develop a written language of their own and translate the scriptures, and then also start to develop a kind of government because there wasn't really a Cherokee nation before this. It was a loose knit of linguistic similarities and tribes that talked to each other. But all of that was coming through this missionary work. And we lose a lot of that stuff in just thinking purely about something like slavery.
Yeah.
And not the world context at the time. And then what we did to end slavery. I mean, reparations, in one sense, reparations was a civil war.
Tony, you touched on the image of God, and I think one of the unique thing about the American idea of nation was the fact that the founders recognized one important thing, and this is American exceptionalism. Someone said that Americans are not exceptional; we all are sinners. That's why
Right.
Yeah,
checks and balances. And that
exactly.
was
Yep.
unique about America, and no other nation that I find in. Whereas so if you see the image of God is one of the common things about us, I think the fact that we all are sinners and broken, need redemption, is another factor that makes us common. And I think with the Marxist framework, oppression becomes, the original sin.
Sin,
And
yep.
so you divide people between oppressor and oppressed.
Right.
That's exactly where the division happens. And I think that creates more issues than uniting people together.
It's
Well, yeah.
basically why we have the 10th commandment. Marxism's like, ignore the 10th commandment, covet all you want. If your neighbor has something you want, it's not your fault. It's not because you didn't get a good deal or didn't work hard. It's because they are being given freebies. And so it just opens up the sin in us already.
Yeah.
And lets it go wild. Because the truth of the matter is, sometimes in life, people get things unfairly. Other times in life, they got it because they worked hard. And I'm not sure that we can do a lot about those two things, because we've had the Soviet Union tried, they failed at it. We've had a lot of people try to correct that, some of the unfairness in life. And the idea that government can do that through force seems to me obviously wrong.
Yeah.
It seemed to me, and I don't know if again this was when I was reading McIntyre's book, which again I would highly recommend. But what Marxism does is it eliminates the moral it shifts the moral component from being in the will of the individual to being just in the abstract relationship between individuals.
Mhm.
Right. And maybe Rousseau does that. Maybe that's
That's what I was about to
something
say. I
in
just
Rousseau
finished a
as
paper.
well.
I just finished a paper I'm going to present at the EPS next November, going over Rousseau, Marx, and Freud.
Yeah, and maybe you've read Carl Truman's book or are
Mhm.
aware of it, His Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which he goes through a wonderful genealogy of ideas there.
Mhm.
But it's so wherever there's just a discrepancy in a relationship, that's where the moral element lies. That's what has to be corrected. Whereas Christians, we would obviously say that's obviously false. The issue is not in the relatio between two persons; it's in the will of the persons who are in that relationship.
Yeah.
Right? You can have a benevolent, you can have so whoever's in a position of authority or power can be the benevolent one, and slaves can abuse their masters, and children can disobey their parents.
Yeah, that's never
You
the
know,
case in Marxism. If you're
yeah,
poor, you're always good.
you're
And we
always
know
good.
that's not true either.
No, it's just none of it's just not
Because
true.
they'll quote from, say, the prophets saying you've been prejudiced against the poor, but there's also commandments in Moses that says don't be prejudiced in favor of the poor
I
because
think
you
it's
can go the other way.
Exodus 20 where he
Yeah.
says, "Do not give partiality to the poor or
Mhm.
disfranchised." So
Yeah, so the idea that
is in the person. It's not in the relationship between persons.
but it's also about our condition in this world. And it's trying to solve what I would call natural evil, which is introduced after sin in Genesis 3, things like toil.
Right.
And that's going to lead, we have old age, sickness, death, and those get exasperated by plagues and wars and famines. All of those are sort of built into the world. That's what it means natural evil. A hurricane that kills people is not a moral agent that we take to court. COVID is not a moral agent we take to court. If someone released it, it is. But the virus itself is just part of the sickness that's in the world. And so it's an attempt to solve those without dealing with sin. But we know that those will never be solved until sin is removed. That's the order of the things. So the idea that you could have a culture that has no toil, this is not going to work. You're just shifting the toil around. Like this group won't toil, this group will toil instead. But you're never going to actually get rid of natural evil.
Well, right, and now there's a question too there on natural evil, where we see that as a byproduct of human agency, of the problem.
Yeah, that's moral
human
evil, right? Yep.
right, moral evil.
Yep.
But now, if at least critical theory is opening the door to again these pre-Christian views of nature, right, where nature is animated with its own innate powers and spirits, that's going to shift. That would shift one's view of what to do
Yeah, they
about
tend to
what we call
think
natural
those
evil, right?
some of those things aren't. Yeah, that's just part of the cycle. As soon as you make it a cycle, you can't speak about good and evil anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right. Even
right.
natural evil or moral evil. Hurricane got you. Well, that's because of Mother Nature. It's not her fault. She's just doing what Mother Nature does.
Right.
Through our ministry, we've been reminding this to the churches that what's happening here in the West is, Tony, you know that I've been saying that the West is becoming Hindu. We're adopting this idea of oneism instead of twoism. Peter Jones talks about that a lot. And I think that's when if the whole of reality is one, then you can't be experiencing any kind of duality, be it in gender, be it in good and evil,
You're
or
right.
any kind of. So polarity would be seen as being working against any kind of flourishing. Whereas,
And that's another. No,
yeah.
sorry.
And I think the Western civilization is built on this idea of twoism, maintaining that distinction between the creator and the creation, and understanding the order in the universe through
Yeah.
that.
God is God and we're not God.
Exactly.
That was the first temptation. You can be as God.
Yeah.
But then what does Krishna say? He says to Arjuna, you are God, right? Atman is Brahman.
Yeah. Aham Brahmasmi. Yeah.
Well,
So
and
I think
you were pointing out
but
too.
yeah, I was talking about how it goes. The feminist and occult goes back to the 1800s. So does this. You know that Vivekananda came and spoke at the World's Parliament of Religions, and he said Hinduism is the answer to the world's problems. And then America had another interest, and that continued. But then America had another interest in this in the Cultural Revolution, right? When the Beatles get disillusioned with Western culture, they go to India, not to China, not to Japan. They go to India, and they bring that back. And we've still got that stuff going on. And even before Vivekananda, Emerson, Walt Whitman, Thoreau, all those guys are reading the Bhagavad Gita. And so when they speak about God, they usually mean something. They don't mean the Christian God, right? They mean something coming out of the Bhagavad Gita. And sometimes Americans are so naive and they'll say, yeah, we have all these guys like Emerson and they love God and they're talking about God and nature. And it's like, yes, nature's God in Emerson or Walt
And
Whitman.
also, if you see the attack on the whole idea of nationalism that we are seeing is because nation itself is a biblical idea, right? So what I'm seeing is actually the coming debate in our discourse would be more between civilizationalism, rather than nationalism. And that's where
Well,
it's,
yeah,
yeah,
I think so. That's what Arnold Toynbee wrote when he wrote History of the World. It was the history of civilizations. And he wrote the ones that had died so far and the ones that were currently alive but almost dead and the ones that were still alive and fighting with each other. And so there really is this kind of cultural conflict right now, or civilizational level conflict between those ideas. And I
Right.
think you're right. If we could sum it up that way and say all is one or God the creator, that really nails it, I think. And that's been that way from the very beginning. And that's
Yeah,
really what
it's just the old conflict, but the way it's come through the culture is unique. The way it's come, well, is interesting how it's come through and now is sort of emerging and almost, I don't want to say dominate, but really permeating throughout, especially the education system. I think
right. Well, I think it's done in the name of multiculturalism. We don't just want to teach Jehovah. We don't want to teach all the gods. And then it transitions into advocating for them.
advocating for
Right.
particular.
So, because a secular religious studies degree like mine is a secular one where you study about all the gods.
Yeah, right.
And then I did, I focus on philosophy of religion. So I focus on, does God A, B, Z exist? But this is going beyond that to saying, yeah, we need to go back to these pagan gods. And I was reading a book I mentioned earlier, the conflict in Mexico and the Marxist revolutionaries who were saying we need to follow Quetzalcoatl. And in the book I was reading, there's a fictional book, and it had a dialogue between a priest and one of the radicals. And the radical was saying, look, Jesus and Mary, they're the European. There's one deity. He makes up everything. So the oneism, Jacob, but he expresses himself in different ways to different cultures. So Jesus and Mary, the Catholics brought, that's how he did it for Europe. But for us, he expressed himself in the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl.
Right.
And that's that's the Mexican deity and the other host that came with it. So again, it goes back to that oneism. Even when they speak of God, God is being itself, and then the deities are emanations of this being.
Right. Find the finite modes of the one, but that
Yep.
manifest themselves historically and in culture relative to history and culture. I tell you, I used to believe that stuff. I used to believe it before I got
and
saved.
this is what
Oh,
leads to,
I would say thing like the chi is the Holy Spirit and
Mm.
all kinds of things like that. There's just different cultural manifestations of
Yeah.
the same spirit of the same God. And you were also mentioning, Owen, in about how Hegel was influenced, or he was reading the Vedics as
Yeah.
well as he
Yep.
was developing his notion of the world spirit.
Yep. Yeah. That's
To
straight out of
become,
Hinduism. I mean,
yeah,
Hegel has this quote from where he says, "In my youth, I decided I wanted to defend Christianity by articulating it better than it has been so far." And so people say, "Okay, he's a very Christian philosopher."
mhm,
But again, when we start to look into him, he does quote the Vedas, and then his ideas line up better with that than they do with Christianity. So what he meant by that was keep Christian words, but give them Hindu meanings.
hmm,
Right.
well,
So
right,
his
yeah,
whole thing of God coming to know himself, I mean,
mhm,
that's just almost straight.
eternal.
I don't know. I don't know if he had access to the Bhagavad Gita. He must have by that time. But there was other. You have to look at which text did he have access to. But that's straight out of the Bhagavad Gita.
Well, and
God becoming aware of himself.
we'll have to do another podcast on this because that launches 1,000 theological ships as well of what we might call progressive theologians or
Yeah. Well, all that stuff is straight. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and
Alfred
I
North
know you're
Whitehead.
a pastor as well, and we might have done one where we hone in on some of the
Yeah.
the liberal theology that comes post Hegel,
Yeah. Well, that's
post
Alfred North
Kant.
Whitehead and
Yeah,
process theology.
process theology.
Again, we try to keep some of these terms,
Yeah,
but that doesn't fit with the twoism that you're mentioning, Jacob.
right.
That fits with the oneism.
Oneism. God is
I
becoming.
had when I was doing research at the East West Center at the University of Hawaii, I was studying with some scholars there, and Roger Ames is one of the most famous Confucian scholars, and he said to us, "The one thing philosophy's proven so far is that there's nothing transcendent." And his big mentor, not personally, but the person he read and influenced him was Alfred North Whitehead.
Mhm,
So he thought that fit really well with Asian and especially Chinese philosophy. But
yeah,
that again, it gets really close to it. That's exactly right. There's two views. All is immanent, or at least something is transcendent.
right,
That's another way to put the same thing.
I
right.
think people here in the West need to be cautious because of this one reason, I would say. That kind of like explains the division that we are seeing even among people, is that the whole idea of emanation that you were talking about, I think it permeates the humanity as well. And that's when you create the caste system, that's what works out. And that's what we are seeing on campuses as well.
Yeah.
And that caste system has been divided on the basis of race today.
Well,
Well, it
right.
is. Yeah.
And
We
yeah,
We
Right.
have a diversity, equity, inclusion, and now they've added B for belonging office. And it gets lots of money, has lots of people working there. And the idea there is it just takes for granted what we've been talking about as true. And then it pushes its agenda forward instead of saying, well, wait a minute, let's question the assumptions about what you mean by diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because those have a specific meaning within your cultural Marxism framework that I don't agree with. But we're not allowed to do that because it just exists. It'd be like having an office of Christianity at ASU. And I think most people would say that's not a place at ASU. You can have student clubs and you can have ministries, but ASU shouldn't be funding an office for Christianity. But this is like the same thing, right? An office for cultural Marxism.
Yeah, when I think what we're starting to see is that again, it still sort of exists under the guise of something like secularism,
Yeah.
but it really is far more religious and far
Yeah,
more
well,
sexually
I do
oriented and
think it
far
is religious, but you can even keep it at the secular level, right? And say there shouldn't be specific things a university advocates that are in our culture being debated right now. Shouldn't take a position on that. That should be
right.
neutral.
Yeah.
Now, of course, their rhetoric is to say, no, we're against bigotry and the other side's bigoted. So I'm not even going to have a debate with bigots. That's the level they'll
Yeah,
take it to, right?
right, exactly. Well, and that's the if sin is not universal, then you're going to get into where there's the conflict between social groups is over. It's just we're not all sinners, but it's going to be who's going to be able to ascribe something like sinfulness to one group and then exculpate your own group from
Well, I
this
think so. And I think
not common to us all.
the Christian message is not just that God is real and we're not God.
Yeah.
It's also that we've sinned against that God.
Right, exactly.
And that God is I say these three things. The third one then is that God's offered us the path of redemption through Christ. And so that's why they might be okay with Islam. They generally don't critique Islam. And that can sound out as strange. Like, why don't they critique Islam? But again, it doesn't make those second two, or especially that third claim. Islam might say you've sinned, but you can rectify it yourself by keeping the 5 pillars.
Right.
That third one requires any blaming of anyone else is over. And the CRT and DEI stuff is all about blaming other people.
Yeah.
You have to fundamentally take responsibility. I sinned against my creator and I can't do anything about it.
Yeah. So it's
unless you
literally
come to
what
that
happens
point.
after Genesis 3, after Adam falls, the blame game starts.
Yep. So
right?
it's not my fault, it's the institution.
Exactly.
Right. It's not my poor choices, it's the institution. And ultimately, even then, it's always the human level. Because I'm not just talking about pure poor choices between humans or taking drugs or something like that. I'm talking about between you and God.
Right.
Right. You rejected him. You've rejected his law and how to live. You set up yourself as your own God, and you have to take responsibility for that. And of course, we know no one who, if you did that, you'd be a Christian, right?
I want to get this in, but then I want to try and pull some of these threads together for our audience. But I have to. There was an article that Angela Harris, who's another very well-known critical legal scholar, wrote years ago called, I think it's called Anti-Essentialism and Feminist Legal Theory. And she describes what it's like to go to a feminist conference, where it's all women, black women, white women, whatever, women of color, and how these meetings, they devolve into these competitions of who has suffered most.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And
They
then
call it the suffering Olympics.
and the suffering, and she's trying to figure out a way to not have everything devolve into a sort of solipsism almost, where people are comparing their social features with each other and then figuring out who's most
suffered the most.
oppressed.
Well, right? And it will be aimed at, even though they'll say that God's not real, it will be aimed at God. And they'll say, God is the one who's made me suffer. I hate him for that reason. And so it really does come out. God hatred is just barely below the surface. They might just talk neutrally. Yes. But when you start to scratch surface, they'll say, I mean, it's like Stephen Hawking. He would say the same thing. I don't believe in God, but I hate that idea because I've been handicapped. And if God exists, he's the one who did it to me.
Huxley said something similar, but it's interesting. Yeah. So that scene, though, at this conference, it really reminded me of the Greytown in Lewis's Great Divorce.
No, it is like that.
Where everybody's just moving complaining further away, and all they're doing is complaining.
Even at the natural level, who'd want to live your life like that?
Yeah.
Just nonstop, a chip on your shoulder. Someone else is always persecuting me. I'm always negative. I mean, it's just not good headspace to be in.
And that's
even if you thought, when I'm dead, I'm dead. I've got 60, maybe 80 years, and that's it. And I'm not living them like that.
And I'm sure that's what you were thinking when you invited Dennis Prager to come and talk on happiness,
Yeah, that's
right?
kind of
That
what he
that
would
would
say
be
too. Yeah.
a solution or a possible way forward for out of
But it
this.
is, I think the sinner is going to be stuck in that for eternity
Yeah,
because it's the essence of sin, blaming someone else for what I've done. And you're right to point that out in the Great Divorce. But I think that, yeah, that'll be the nature of it. And
yeah,
and the anti-essentialism, this comes back to Jacob's point about oneism.
yeah,
You can't make any distinctions finally in oneism. They're all impermanent.
yeah,
And you say, like you said, male, female, true, false, God and not God. And what that requires is because that's what reason does. We use reason to distinguish between A and non-A, God and not God, man and not man. And so it is a combat between reason and non-reason, or between the logos, which made all things, and anti-logos.
right.
And so I think
And
that's another way
all
we've
things hold together as well.
yeah, we've phrased it a few different ways, the differences, but that's another one is that ultimately it's a hatred of rationality as well. And I don't mean Habermasian rationality, which is just practical efficiency.
Yeah,
I mean our ability to understand God's creation and see his glory revealed in it.
yeah, yeah. The Socratic and the Christian are under attack.
I'm
Well,
reminded of something Os Guinness once said during one of the lectures I was attending. He said, contrast is the mother of clarity. And the reason we don't have clarity in culture is because we don't have anything to contrast between.
Yeah, good point.
well, Owen, this has been I mean, we could go on for
It's
quite
really
some
good.
time on many tangents. I want to try and draw some of the things together. So, you've talked a little bit about what you've seen on campus at ASU. I think the domain of education and the culture is still primarily where this battle is being carried out.
Mhm.
I think Francis Schaeffer pointed out years ago how ideas trickle, at least in the West, trickle through the academy and
Mhm.
then affect the popular culture. So I know you're there at ASU fighting the good fight for
Well, we
truth.
do need people
Yeah,
to go into it. I mean,
yeah. Thank you.
there's that
Tell
cultural
us what
side.
you see that Christians can do, or
Yeah.
just reasonable people to sort of get involved in this fight because it is a civilizational battle.
Yeah, I would say if you feel called to this area of life, then do it and be a good scholar.
Yeah,
Right? Just actually be what a good scholar is. You're studying the world, you're studying God's creation and what it reveals about him in whatever discipline you're in. But then when you have that role, you also have a responsibility to speak up and defend values associated with what I just mentioned. So there is a real world. We can study it. We can use reason to do so. We recognize free speech so we can have debates. And that's the essence of free speech. That's something else that happens is free speech turns into free screaming. I have the freedom to scream expletives at you. And that's not free speech. Free speech is the freedom to debate our positions. Here's my thesis and here's my arguments. Now you tell me yours. So we want to defend those values. So I would encourage Christians to get involved in that and defend that and learn arguments to support your case as a Christian.
that's right. Well, and I hope we can encourage people to do so because we really need it, and we really need to at least reclaim some ground in the academy. We really do. Dr. Owen Anderson at Arizona State University, thank you so much for being on this episode of the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. We hope that we'll be able to do it again soon.
Yeah, me too.
All right. God bless.